finally, story number 4. This one happened just last year, and it's the reason an entire town is slowly disappearing from the map. If you still think you're safe inside a church, think again. This is as dark as it gets. This happened last year, in 2024, in a place so small it doesn't even appear on most maps. Milbrook, Oregon. Population 347. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, where nothing exciting ever happens, where the biggest event of the year is the 4th of July parade and the annual Christmas Eve service at the Old Stone Church. The church had been standing since 1887, built by the town's founding families with stones hauled from the nearby quarry. It was a simple structure, beautiful in its plainness, with tall arched windows, wooden pews that had been sat in by 5 generations of families, and a bell tower that still rang out every Sunday morning to call the faithful to worship. Father Michael Reeves had been the priest there for 12 years, beloved by his congregation, known for his gentle sermons and his genuine care for every member of his small flock.
Christmas Eve was always special in Milbrook. The tradition was that everyone, and I mean everyone, came to the 11 p.m. service. It didn't matter if you were a regular churchgoer or if you only showed up once a year. Christmas Eve at Old Stone Church was community. It was tradition. It was the one night when the entire town came together under one roof to celebrate. Father Michael would light candles. The choir would sing carols. Children would perform a small nativity play, and at midnight, everyone would ring handbells together while singing Silent Night. It was wholesome and pure, and exactly the kind of Norman Rockwell painting come to life that you'd expect from a tiny rural Oregon town.
On December 24th, 2024, the weather was typical for that time of year. Cold, hovering just above freezing, with a light snow falling that made everything look like a postcard. By 10:30 p.m., people started arriving at the church, stamping snow off their boots, greeting neighbors they'd known their entire lives, filing into the pews that their families had occupied for decades. By 10:45, the church was nearly full, 63 people in attendance, which was actually a good turnout considering some families were traveling for the holidays. Father Michael stood at the front, wearing his ceremonial robes, smiling and welcoming everyone, making small talk with the elderly Mrs. Patterson about her arthritis, congratulating young Tommy Chin on making the honor roll, asking the Morrison family about their new baby. Everything was normal. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be.
At exactly 11 p.m., Father Michael began the service. The opening hymn was "O Come All Ye Faithful," and the sound of 63 voices raised together in that small stone church was beautiful enough to make even non-believers feel something stirring in their chest. The children performed their nativity play, with little Emma Rodriguez as Mary, doing an admirable job of looking serene while holding a doll wrapped in swaddling clothes. Father Michael read from the Gospel of Luke, the familiar story of the birth of Christ, his voice calm and reassuring. Everything was proceeding exactly as it had for over a century. And then, at 11:37 p.m., the door at the back of the church opened.
Everyone heard it. The old wooden door had a distinctive creak, and the sound of it opening cut through Father Michael's reading like a knife. He paused mid-sentence, looking up from his Bible. The congregation turned in their pews, curious about who would be arriving so late. And there, silhouetted in the doorway against the falling snow outside, was a figure. A man, they thought, though it was hard to tell. Tall, well over 6 feet, wearing a long, dark coat that hung to his ankles. The coat looked old-fashioned, like something from the Victorian era, made of heavy wool or maybe even heavier material. The figure wore a hood pulled up, completely obscuring his face in shadow. For a moment, he just stood there, framed in the doorway, snow swirling behind him, not moving, not speaking, just standing.
Father Michael, ever the gracious host, smiled and gestured toward the empty pews at the back. "Please come in," he said, his voice welcoming. "You're not late. Join us." The figure moved then, stepping through the doorway and closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow seemed too loud in the sudden silence. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps making no sound at all on the old wooden floorboards. That was the first thing people noticed, the absolute silence of his movement. No creak of boards, no rustle of clothing, no sound of breathing, just silent forward motion, deliberate and slow. He passed the back pews where the Patterson family sat, and Mrs. Patterson later told police that she felt a wave of cold air wash over her as he went by, cold so intense it made her bones ache. He passed the middle pews, and young Tommy Chin, sitting with his parents, said later that he tried to look up at the man's face under the hood, but couldn't. His eyes just wouldn't focus, like trying to look at something in your peripheral vision that disappears when you turn to face it directly.
The figure reached the last row of pews, the ones closest to the altar, but strangely always the least occupied, and he sat down. Slowly, carefully, as if his body didn't quite bend the way human bodies should. And then he was still, completely, utterly still, not fidgeting, not adjusting his position, not moving at all, just sitting there with his hands in his lap, his hooded head facing forward toward the altar. Father Michael, feeling slightly unnerved but not wanting to be inhospitable, continued with the service. He finished the reading from Luke, led the congregation in another hymn, began his sermon about the meaning of Emmanuel, God with us. But his attention kept drifting to the figure in the back row. Something about the man's absolute stillness was deeply unsettling. It wasn't the stillness of meditation or prayer. It was the stillness of something that didn't need to breathe. Other members of the congregation felt it too. That wrongness, that sense that something was deeply, fundamentally not right. Several people later reported feeling watched, despite the figure never turning his head to look at them. Some said the temperature in the church dropped noticeably after the figure arrived, their breath misting in the air, despite the heating system running. Others reported a smell, faint but nauseating, like sulfur mixed with rotting vegetation, like something from deep underground where nothing living should be. Children became restless, fussy in a way they usually weren't, sensing on some primal level that something dangerous was present. Little Emma Rodriguez, still in her merry costume, started crying and refused to go back to her spot for the final scene of the nativity play. Her mother had to hold her, and Emma kept pointing at the back of the church and saying, "There's something wrong with that man. There's something wrong with his face." But from where her mother sat, she couldn't see anything except the figure's back and the hood covering his head. Father Michael tried to push through the service, tried to maintain the sacred atmosphere, but even he was struggling now. His hands trembled as he held his Bible. His voice wavered slightly when he spoke. He kept losing his place in the readings, having to backtrack and start verses over. And all the while, the figure sat in perfect stillness, never moving, never responding to the hymns or the prayers or the sermon, just sitting, watching, or at least everyone assumed he was watching. No one could actually see his face. The hood cast such a deep shadow that there might as well have been nothing under there at all, just an empty void where a face should be. At 11:55, Father Michael decided to skip ahead to the final tradition, the midnight bell ringing and the singing of Silent Night. He wanted this service to be over. He wanted everyone to leave, to
get out of the church, to get away from whatever was sitting in that back pew. He distributed the handbells to the congregation, brass bells that had been used for this tradition since the church was built, each one with a clear, pure tone. Everyone stood, holding their bells, waiting for the clock tower to strike midnight. The children held small silver bells, the adults held larger brass ones, and Father Michael held the largest bell of all, the one that had belonged to the church's first priest. 11:59. Everyone tensed, waiting. And then, midnight, the tower bell began to toll.
And that's when everything went wrong. The tower bell's tone was wrong. Instead of the clear, resonant peal that everyone knew, it rang with a discordant, almost painful sound, like metal scraping against metal, like something screaming. The handheld bells, when the congregation began to ring them, produced similar wrong notes, out of tune, clashing, creating a cacophony that made people's teeth hurt. Several people stopped ringing their bells immediately, disturbed by the awful sound. But some continued, either not noticing the wrongness or too committed to tradition to stop. And they began to sing, "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." Except all was not calm, all was not bright. The church lights flickered, once, twice, then steadied but noticeably dimmer than before. The temperature dropped even further, cold enough now that everyone could see their breath, cold enough that frost began to form on the inside of the windows.
And the figures stood up. For the first time since sitting down, he moved. He rose to his feet with that same uncanny smoothness, his body unfolding in a way that seemed to have too many joints, too many angles. He stood facing the altar, facing Father Michael, and slowly, deliberately, he reached up and pulled back his hood. Multiple people screamed. Mrs. Patterson fainted. Tommy Chen's father grabbed his son and turned his face away, covering the boy's eyes. Because what was under that hood was not a human face. Or rather, it was a human face, but wrong. The features were there, eyes and nose and mouth, but they were arranged in a way that created a distortion, an uncanny valley effect that made the human brain recoil. The proportions were slightly off, the skin too smooth and waxy, like something molded from wax or clay. The eyes were the worst. They were black, completely black. No whites, no iris, just solid black that reflected the candlelight like polished obsidian. And they didn't blink, not once, just stared with that terrible, unblinking gaze directly at Father Michael. The figure's mouth moved, not speaking words, but moving in a strange pattern, lips forming shapes that didn't correspond to any language anyone recognized. And from somewhere, not from the figure's mouth, but from all around, from the walls themselves, came a sound, a low, resonant humming that vibrated in everyone's chest, that made their hearts skip beats, that felt like it was pulling at something deep inside them, trying to drag it out. Several people clutched at their chests, feeling actual physical pain. Others doubled over, nauseous and dizzy. Father Michael, his face pale as death, held up the silver cross that hung around his neck and began to pray. The Lord's Prayer, said with a fervor and desperation that came from true fear. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. His voice shook,
but didn't break.
And the figure tilted its head, a slow, mechanical movement, like a bird studying something curious. It took a step forward, moving into the center aisle. Another step. The humming grew louder, deeper, more oppressive. People were crying now, some praying, some just frozen in terror. The Morrison baby was shrieking, a high-pitched wail that cut through everything else. Father Michael continued praying, louder now, almost shouting, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." The figure took another step. The candles on the altar began to flicker wildly, their flames stretching upward in ways that defied physics, reaching toward the ceiling like desperate fingers. The frost on the windows spread, intricate patterns forming that looked almost like words in a language that predated human civilization.
Robert stood his ground, but several people saw his hands shaking. The figure continued to smile, that awful smile, and then it spoke. Its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonant and hollow, like an echo in an empty cathedral. "We have always been here," it said. "We have always watched. We have always waited. You pray to the light, but you forget that light creates shadow. You celebrate birth, but you forget that birth requires death. We are the silence between prayers. We are the cold in the midnight. We are what waits in the places you do not look. And we are patient, so very patient." The figure's smile widened impossibly further. "This is our night too. We are part of the story. We always have been. You just choose not to see us. But tonight, we choose to be seen. Consider it a gift, a reminder that the world is not as safe as you pretend it is."
Father Michael found his voice, found his courage somewhere deep in his faith. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave," he said, his words steady now despite his fear. "You have no power here. This ground is consecrated. These people are under God's protection. Leave, now." The figure's smile faded. It looked at Father Michael with those bottomless black eyes, and for a moment, there was something like respect in that alien gaze. "You have faith," it said, "real faith. That is rare. That is precious. We will not take it from you tonight. But know this, priest, we could. We could take everything, everyone, in a moment, in a breath. But we choose not to. Not yet. We are patient. We can wait. We have waited so long already. What is another lifetime? Another century? Time means nothing to us. But someday, when the light fades and the cold grows deeper, when faith weakens and fear grows stronger, we will return. And on that day, no prayers will protect you." The figure pulled its hood back up, concealing that terrible face once more. It turned and walked toward the door, that same silent, gliding motion. When it reached the entrance, it paused and looked back one final time. The congregation saw the shadow under the hood shift, as if the face underneath was changing, becoming something even worse. "Merry Christmas," it said, and there was such mockery in those words, such contempt for everything the holiday represented. Then it opened the door and stepped out into the snow. The door closed behind it with that same too loud click, and it was gone. For several seconds, no one moved, no one breathed,
Then someone sobbed, and it broke the spell. People rushed for the doors, desperate to get out, to get home, to get away. Father Michael tried to restore order, tried to lead a closing prayer, but no one was listening. Within 10 minutes, the church was empty, except for Father Michael, standing alone at the altar, staring at the place where the figure had stood. The candles had returned to normal. The temperature was rising. The frost on the windows was melting. Everything was becoming normal again. But nothing would ever truly be normal again.
The police were called, of course. Chief Anderson came down to the church, took statements from everyone who was willing to talk, which was most of them because the shared trauma needed to be processed somehow. The descriptions were all remarkably consistent, which disturbed the chief more than if they had been wildly different. If everyone had described something different, it could be explained as mass hysteria, confusion, misidentification. But 63 people all describing the same thing, the same impossible details, the same feeling of wrongness. That wasn't something he could easily dismiss. He examined the church himself, looking for evidence. He found the pew where the figure had sat. The wood was discolored there, darker than the surrounding area, and when he touched it, it was cold. Not just cool, cold, like ice, like it had absorbed all the warmth from the air around it. And there was a smell, faint, but definitely present, sulfur and rot. The smell lingered for days afterward, no matter how much they cleaned.
More disturbing were the marks on the pew. Burned into the wood where the figure's hands would have rested were impressions. Not handprints exactly. The shape was wrong, the fingers too long, the palm too narrow. Chief Anderson took photographs, sent them to a forensics expert he knew from the state police. The expert called him back 3 days later and said, in a shaken voice, that he had no explanation. The marks showed charring consistent with extreme heat, but there was no accelerant, no chemical residue, nothing to explain how wood could burn in that specific pattern without catching fire. And the depth of the marks suggested pressure far beyond what human hands could exert. Something had gripped that pew hard enough to leave permanent impressions in solid oak wood. Something strong, something hot, something that should not exist.
In the weeks following Christmas, strange things started happening in Milbrook. Small things at first. Animals behaving oddly, dogs barking at nothing, cats refusing to go into certain areas. People reported feeling watched when they were alone, hearing footsteps in empty rooms, seeing shadows that moved wrong, that seemed too dark, too solid, that didn't match any light source. 3 people died in January. Old Bill Morrison, heart attack in his sleep. Natural causes, the doctor said, except Bill's face when they found him was locked in an expression of terror. Sarah Chen, Tommy's mother, car accident on a clear day on a road she'd driven 1,000 times. She swerved off the road for no apparent reason, drove straight into a tree at 50 miles per hour, killed instantly. And finally, young Emma Rodriguez, the little girl who played Mary in the Nativity play. She got sick the day after Christmas, started with a fever, progressed to something the doctors couldn't diagnose. She wasted away over 3 weeks, her body failing despite every treatment they tried. She died on January 21st, her last words spoken to her mother in a whisper. "The man from church is here. He says it's time to go."
Father Michael tried to hold the community together, tried to provide comfort and spiritual guidance, but he was struggling himself. He couldn't sleep anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that face, those black eyes, that impossible smile. increased security at the church, installed cameras and motion sensors, but deep down he knew those precautions were useless. Whatever had visited them on Christmas Eve was beyond such mundane defenses. In March, he requested a transfer. The diocese granted it without question. They had heard about what happened in Milbrook, though the official report filed by the church simply stated, "Unexplained incident requiring pastoral transition." Father Michael moved to a church in California, as far from Oregon as he could get while remaining on the West Coast. But he still has nightmares, still wakes up in cold sweats, feeling watched, feeling that presence looming over him.
The old stone church was closed for renovations that lasted 6 months. When it reopened, it was technically the same building, but something felt different. Empty, hollow. The congregation had dwindled to less than 20 regular attendees. Most of the families who had been at the Christmas Eve service had moved away or simply stopped coming. The town itself began to decline. Businesses closed. Young people left as soon as they graduated high school. The population dropped from 347 to just under 200. Milbrook was dying. Slowly but surely, the life draining out of it, like blood from a wound.
And every Christmas Eve, without fail, someone reports seeing a figure, tall, wearing a long dark coat, standing outside the church, just standing there in the falling snow, watching. Sometimes it's there for hours, sometimes only minutes, but it's always seen, always watching, waiting with infinite patience for the day when it will return inside, when it will take what it came for, because it made a promise, didn't it? Not yet, not yet, but someday when faith has weakened enough, when fear has grown strong enough, when the light has dimmed enough, it will come back. And on that day, every prayer will go unanswered, every plea will fall on deaf ears, because some things are older than faith, older than hope, older than light itself, and they are very, very patient.
So, if you're ever in a small town on Christmas Eve and you see a tall figure in a dark coat standing outside a church, watching the faithful gather inside to celebrate the birth of the light, do yourself a favor. Don't look too closely. Don't try to see the face under the hood. Don't acknowledge its presence in any way. Just go inside quickly, lock the doors, say your prayers, and hope that tonight is not the night it decides to come inside again. Because next time, it might not leave. Next time, it might not be satisfied with just watching. Next time, it might be ready to collect. And when that happens, no amount of faith, no number of prayers, no holy ground will be enough to protect you, because it has been here longer than any church, longer than any religion. It was here in the darkness before the first light was spoken into existence, and it will be here long after the last light fades away. Patient, eternal, waiting, always waiting for Christmas to come again.
So,
If you're ever in a small town on Christmas Eve and you see a tall figure in a dark coat standing outside a church, watching the faithful gather inside to celebrate the birth of the light, do yourself a favor. Don't look too closely. Don't try to see the face under the hood. Don't acknowledge its presence in any way. Just go inside quickly, lock the doors, say your prayers, and hope that tonight is not the night it decides to come inside again. Because next time, it might not leave. Next time, it might not be satisfied with just watching. Next time, it might be ready to collect. And when that happens, no amount of faith, no number of prayers, no holy ground will be enough to protect you, because it has been here longer than any church, longer than any religion. It was here in the darkness before the first light was spoken into existence, and it will be here long after the last light fades away. Patient, eternal, waiting, always waiting for Christmas to come again.